The night my sister told me to leave, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't throw my things onto the lawn or scream that she hated me. She stood in the doorway of our parents' house, arms folded, and said it calmly, almost kindly. "You should go, and don't ever come back." It was 3 days before New Year's Eve. I remember the smell of pine cleaner on the hardwood floors, the sound of the grandfather clock ticking behind her, the way the house felt too warm while my hands went cold. Our parents were in the living room. The television was on, muted. No one looked at me. Later that night, after I packed a single bag and drove away, my phone buzzed. A text from my mother. "You shouldn't attend the party. You only embarrass us." I sat alone in my car engine, idling, staring at that sentence until the words stopped looking real. I didn't reply. I didn't cry. I just drove. I thought that would be the end of it, the quiet kind of ending families prefer. The kind where one person disappears and everyone else pretends it was mutual. But at exactly 12:01 on New Year's morning, my younger brother called. His voice was shaking so badly I barely recognized it. "What did you do?" he whispered. "Dad just saw the news, and he's not breathing right." I leaned back against the wall of my tiny apartment and closed my eyes. The truth had finally caught up with them, and there was no way to put it back. 3 weeks earlier, I still believed I could fix things. I was 30 years old, the middle child, the quiet one. My sister had always been the center of the room. She knew how to charm people, how to manage impressions, how to decide what was acceptable and what wasn't. Our parents trusted her judgment without ever questioning it. I told myself it was just her personality, strong, decisive, responsible. I told myself my role was different. When I came home for the holidays that year, I arrived with the same familiar mix of hope and caution. I had learned not to announce my successes, not to explain too much, not to correct people when they summarized my life incorrectly. It was easier that way. The house looked exactly the same as it always had. Fresh wreath on the door, framed family photos lining the hallway, the smell of cinnamon and something roasting in the oven. It was supposed to feel comforting. Instead, it felt like stepping into a place where I no longer knew the rules. My sister barely greeted me. She nodded, smiled for half a second, then turned back to her phone. Our parents asked about traffic, about the weather, about whether I'd eaten. No one asked why I'd come early or how long I planned to stay. That first night we ate dinner together like we always did. Plates passed, glasses clinked. Small talk floated safely on the surface. I answered questions politely, vaguely. I had learned that clarity made people uncomfortable. At some point, my sister mentioned the New Year's Eve party she was hosting. Friends, colleagues, a few important people. She spoke about it like it was already a success. I listened quietly, assuming foolishly that I was included. After dinner, she asked me to step into the kitchen. She closed the door behind us and leaned against the counter. Her voice was calm, measured, the voice she used when she'd already decided something. "This year is different," she said. "There's a lot riding on this party." I nodded, not sure what she meant. She looked at me, then really looked at me the way someone does when they're weighing cost against benefit. "You have a way of making things awkward," she said. "You don't mean to, but you do." I waited for her to soften it. She didn't. "You don't fit the atmosphere we're trying to create," she continued. "It's better if you're not here." I laughed once, short and disbelieving. "You're uninviting me from New Year's Eve." "I'm asking you to be reasonable," she said. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I opened my mouth to argue, to explain, to ask how I had embarrassed anyone at all. But before I could, she added, "If you stay, it's going to cause problems. For all of us." That was the moment I realized this wasn't a request. When we walked back into the living room, our parents didn't ask what we'd talked about. They didn't look surprised when I went upstairs to pack. No one followed me. No one told me to stay. The text from my mother came an hour later. Short. Final. I left before midnight, driving away from the only house I'd ever known, telling myself it was temporary, that things would cool down, that after the holidays we'd talk. I had no idea that my sister had already closed the door behind me. And I had no idea that by the time the new year arrived, my name would be everywhere she never wanted it to be. I didn't tell anyone where I was staying after I left that night. I rented a small furnished apartment across town, the kind meant for short stays and long silences. Beige walls, a bed that squeaked if I turned too quickly, a single window that looked out over a parking lot instead of a yard full of memories. It wasn't home, but it was quiet, and quiet felt safer than pretending nothing had happened. For the first few days, I told myself this was temporary. Families fought, sisters clashed, holidays amplified everything. I had spent my whole life smoothing things over, taking the long way around conflict, believing that if I stayed patient enough, things would settle. I still believed that then. What I didn't understand yet was that this wasn't about an argument. It was about position. Growing up, my sister had always occupied the center of our family like it was assigned at birth. She was decisive, articulate, confident in ways that made other people relax. Teachers praised her leadership. Relatives deferred to her opinions. Even our parents spoke about her future with a certainty they never used with me. "She knows how to handle people," my mother used to say proudly. I learned early that my role was different. I was observant, thoughtful, quieter. I noticed things before I spoke, and when I did speak, it was usually to clarify, not to perform. That difference never seemed to bother anyone when we were young. It became a problem only when we were older. At family gatherings, my sister told the stories. I filled the gaps. She framed the narrative. I stayed inside it. When people asked what I did, she often answered for me, smiling as if she were helping. "She's still figuring things out," she'd say lightly. "She's always been more behind the scenes. No one ever corrected her, not even me." I told myself it didn't matter because my work wasn't for them. I had built my life quietly, intentionally. I didn't chase approval because I'd learned not to expect it. But approval and control are different things, and I didn't realize when one had started to replace the other. The first week after I left the house, I barely heard from my family. No calls, no check-ins. Just silence that felt deliberate, like a pause meant to teach me something. I busied myself with work. It was easier than thinking. My projects had always been my refuge, the one place where effort led to progress and clarity followed discipline. I told myself that if I stayed focused, the rest would sort itself out. Then a few days before Christmas, my aunt called. Her voice was gentle but cautious, the way people sound when they already know more than they're saying. "I heard you weren't coming to New Year's," she said. "Everything okay?" I hesitated. This was the moment where I could explain, where I could finally tell my version. The words pressed against my throat, heavy and urgent. Instead, I said, "It just didn't work out this year." There was a pause on the line. "Oh," she said, "your sister mentioned you were overwhelmed, that you needed space." That was the first time I realized my absence already had a story. I hung up and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. It wasn't anger I felt then. It was something colder. A recognition. I hadn't left the family narrative. I'd been edited out of it. Over the next few days, it happened again and again. A cousin texted to check in, referencing something my sister had told them. An old family friend sent a polite message wishing me peace during a stressful time, as if I'd caused it. Each version painted me as fragile, difficult, or unstable, someone who needed distance for everyone's sake. No one asked me what had happened, and I understood why. My sister had always been the reliable one, the interpreter, the filter. People trusted her version because it made sense and required nothing from them. Correcting it would mean disrupting the comfort of a story they already accepted. I thought about calling my parents then, about demanding a conversation, about asking why they hadn't stopped her, why they hadn't even warned me. But deep down, I already knew the answer. They hadn't stopped her because they didn't see a reason to. That realization hurt more than being told to leave. On Christmas morning, I woke up early, not because I was excited, but because my body was still trained to anticipate family schedules. I made coffee and sat at the small table by the window, watching cars come and go in the parking lot. My phone buzzed once. A group message from extended family. Holiday greetings. Photos followed. Smiling faces. Familiar rooms. The house I'd left glowing warmly in the background. I wasn't in any of them. No one mentioned it. That was when something shifted inside me quietly but completely. I stopped waiting for clarification. I stopped expecting fairness to appear on its own. I understood then that exclusion wasn't a misunderstanding to be corrected. It was a decision that had already been made and carefully justified. And if my sister had decided I was a liability to her version of the family, then anything I shared, anything I said, anything I built would eventually be filtered through that lens. I didn't confront her. I didn't call my parents. I didn't defend myself to anyone. Instead, I did something much smaller and much more important. I stopped explaining my life to people who were invested in misunderstanding it. At the time, it felt like retreat, like self-protection bordering on surrender. I didn't know yet that this was the moment everything began to turn. At the time, I didn't think my work mattered enough to cause problems. That was the mistake. I had always treated what I was building as something private, almost fragile, like a plant you don't bring outside until it's strong enough to survive weather. I worked quietly, methodically, without asking for validation. I assumed that made it invisible. I didn't understand yet that invisibility only exists until someone decides to look. The first time my work was made small happened at a family gathering I almost didn't attend. It wasn't a holiday, just a casual dinner, the kind that felt safe because expectations were low. A few relatives, a couple of friends of my parents. Wine poured food past conversation moving in gentle circles. I sat near the end of the table listening more than speaking like I always did. At some point, one of my father's friends turned to me and asked kindly what I'd been working on lately. It was the kind of question people ask out of politeness, not curiosity, and I answered the way I always did, carefully without embellishment. Before I finished my first sentence, my sister laughed softly and cut in. "She's been playing around with some ideas," she said, smiling. "Nothing concrete yet. You know how she is, always tinkering." The table chuckled lightly approvingly. The moment passed so quickly it almost felt accidental. Almost. I sat there with my mouth half open, the rest of my explanation collapsing inward. No one looked back at me. No one asked a follow-up question. The conversation drifted on to something easier, something more entertaining. I told myself it was nothing, a misunderstanding, poor phrasing. But the feeling didn't leave. It stayed with me as I watched the rest of the evening unfold, as I noticed how effortlessly my sister guided the room. She filled silences. She redirected attention. She spoke with confidence that made people nod along without thinking too hard. And I realized something uncomfortable. What she had said wasn't wrong enough to challenge, but it wasn't right either. It framed my work as tentative, unserious, unfinished. It placed it firmly in the category of things that didn't need to be taken seriously yet, or ever. Later, when dessert was being cleared, someone mentioned careers again. Another harmless opening. This time, my sister didn't even wait for the question. "She's more behind the scenes," she said. "Very smart, just not really focused on outcomes. It's more conceptual." The words landed gently. That was the problem. There was nothing overtly cruel about them. Nothing I could call out without seeming defensive or difficult. They did their damage quietly, reshaping how the room saw me without ever raising suspicion. I glanced toward my parents, then instinctively. My mother was nodding, distracted, already engaged in another conversation. My father smiled faintly, as if this was all accurate enough to move past. Neither of them corrected her. Neither of them added context or clarity or truth. That was when I felt it sharp and unmistakable. Not embarrassment, not anger. Confirmation. This wasn't just my sister's perception. It had become the family's. After dinner, I found myself alone in the kitchen with her while everyone else filtered into the living room. The hum of conversation carried through the doorway, safe and distant. I didn't plan to say anything, it just slipped out. "That's not really how I'd describe my work," I said quietly. She looked up from her phone, mildly surprised, as if I'd spoken out of turn. "I was simplifying," she said. "People don't need all the details." "They asked," I said. I was answering. She smiled then, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're overthinking it," she said. "You always do. I was helping you. You don't want to overwhelm people or make them uncomfortable." Uncomfortable. The word hung between us, heavy with implication. I realized then that she didn't see what she was doing as dismissive. She saw it as management. She was shaping how I appeared to others, deciding how much of me was acceptable, and she expected my gratitude. I wanted to argue, to explain, to reclaim the ground she'd quietly taken. But something stopped me. I saw in that moment how easily anything I said could be reframed, how any pushback would be interpreted as sensitivity, insecurity, or proof that she was right. So I didn't argue. I nodded. I let it go. I did what I'd always done. But inside something shifted. It wasn't rage. It wasn't resolve. It was awareness. I understood then that my work wasn't being ignored. It was being interpreted through someone else's lens, reduced to something manageable, something that didn't disrupt the hierarchy everyone was comfortable with. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the evening in my mind. Not the words themselves, but the reactions. The way no one had questioned her version. The way it had slid into place so easily. Brilliance, I realized, wasn't threatening in my family. Independence was. As long as my work stayed abstract, unfinished, safely behind the scenes, it posed no challenge. The moment it became concrete, definable, real, it would need to be accounted for. And accounting for it would mean acknowledging me. That was when I made a quiet decision, one I didn't announce to anyone. If my work was going to be discussed, it would no longer be by people invested in making it smaller. I didn't know yet what that would require of me. I didn't know how far this would go. I only knew one thing for certain. The next time my work spoke for itself, it wouldn't need anyone to translate it. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to become secretive. I didn't sit down and tell myself I would stop trusting my family, or that I would keep parts of my life hidden out of spite. What happened was quieter than that. I adapted. Slowly. Almost without noticing. After that dinner, after the way my sister spoke about my work, and the way everyone accepted it, something in me recalibrated. I stopped offering information the way I used to. I answered questions briefly. I didn't volunteer updates. I didn't correct assumptions unless they were truly wrong in a way that mattered. No one commented on the change. No one seemed to notice. That should have told me everything. I used to think boundaries had to be announced to be real, that if you didn't explain them, people wouldn't respect them. What I learned instead was that people who benefit from your openness rarely ask why it disappears. They just adjust to the silence. I still came around. I still showed up to family dinners, birthdays, the occasional Sunday afternoon visit. On the surface, nothing had changed. We talked about neutral things, work in general terms, plans that never included specifics, but I stopped letting my guard down. When my sister asked what I was working on, I smiled and said, "A few things." When my parents asked how everything was going, I said, "Busy, but good." It wasn't dishonesty. It was discretion. For the first time, I understood that access was not owed just because someone shared your last name. Around the same time, I started keeping better records. At first, it wasn't intentional. I saved drafts instead of overwriting them. I organized emails into folders. I kept notes dated and labeled instead of scattered across notebooks and devices. It felt like tidying up, not preparation. But there was comfort in knowing where things were, in being able to trace an idea from its earliest form to its most recent iteration, in seeing proof of progression instead of relying on memory. Clarity, I learned, feels a lot like safety. There was a moment not long after when I realized how different my family's response was compared to the rest of the world. I met with someone outside my usual circle, a professional contact who had no history with me beyond my work. We talked for over an hour. He asked thoughtful questions, specific ones. He listened without interrupting, without simplifying, without reframing my words into something more convenient. At the end of the conversation, he said, "This is solid. You've clearly put a lot of thought into it." That was it. No qualifiers, no minimizing, no translation. I walked out of that meeting with a strange mix of relief and grief. Relief that I hadn't imagined my own competence. Grief that it had taken a stranger to reflect it back to me. The contrast was impossible to ignore. With my family, silence meant retreat. With everyone else, silence meant focus. My sister interpreted my lack of sharing as withdrawal, as stepping back, as proof that she had been right to manage the narrative around me. I could feel it in the way she spoke, the subtle authority she assumed. "She's taking some time," she told people. "She's keeping things low-key." She wasn't wrong. She just didn't know why. The moment that sealed it for me came during a brief conversation I hadn't planned to have. We were alone in the living room, the house unusually quiet. She asked casually what direction I was taking next. The question sounded genuine enough, but something in her tone made me pause. I answered vaguely, as I had been doing. She smiled, but there was a flicker of irritation beneath it. "You don't have to be so guarded," she said. "We're family." The word landed wrong. Family to her meant transparency on her terms. Access without reciprocity. Information she could frame, contextualize, decide how much weight it carried. I realized then that my silence wasn't being perceived as privacy. It was being perceived as resistance. And resistance made people nervous. That night alone in my apartment, I looked over the files I'd organized, the notes I'd saved, the work that had continued to grow quietly while no one was paying attention. I felt something settle in my chest. I didn't need to announce what I was doing. I didn't need to justify why I was doing it. I didn't need to ask for room. I just needed to protect it. I wasn't plotting revenge. I wasn't anticipating betrayal in any dramatic sense. I was simply no longer willing to let my life be filtered through someone else's comfort. Silence stopped feeling like absence. It started feeling like choice. I didn't know then how important that choice would become. I didn't know how quickly my sister would move from interpreting my quiet to trying to control it. All I knew was that for the first time, I was holding something that was entirely mine. And I wasn't going to hand it over just because someone expected me to. I felt the shift before anyone said anything out loud. It was subtle at first, the kind of change you only notice if you're used to paying attention. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. Plans were mentioned after they had already been decided. Information reached me late, filtered, simplified. I wasn't being ignored. I was being managed. The first decision made without me seemed small enough to dismiss. My sister announced casually that she had reorganized the family schedule for the coming weeks. Visits, dinners, events. She spoke as if she were reading from a finalized list. When I asked where I fit into it, she glanced at me, then at our parents, and said, "We figured it would be easier if you sat a few things out. Easier for who I wanted to ask." Instead, I said, why her expression didn't change, but her tone did. "You've seemed stressed," she said. "A little distant. We don't want to overwhelm you." There it was. Concern perfectly packaged. I looked to my parents instinctively, expecting at least a question. My father shifted in his seat. My mother nodded once as if this explanation made complete sense. "Your sister's just trying to keep things smooth," my mother said. "There's no reason to make this into something bigger than it is." That phrase became a refrain. Don't make it bigger. Don't take it personally. Don't create tension. Every time I pushed back even gently, the response was the same. I was being difficult, sensitive, misreading intentions. What I was actually doing was noticing patterns. My sister began invoking reputation more openly after that. How things looked, what people might think, the importance of presenting a united front. She spoke about the family as if it were a brand that needed careful management. And somehow I had become a risk to it. It wasn't about anything I'd done wrong. It was about what I didn't do easily. I didn't perform enthusiasm on command. I didn't soften my opinions to make them more palatable. I didn't disappear politely when it was convenient. That made me unpredictable. One afternoon, she pulled me aside before dinner. The house was busy, voices carrying from other rooms. She stood close enough that no one else could hear us, her posture relaxed, almost affectionate. "I need you to understand something," she said quietly. "Right now isn't the time for uncertainty." I waited. "There are things in motion," she continued. "People watching, decisions being made. We can't afford distractions." Distractions. She met my eyes, then her expression calm, almost apologetic. "You don't want people getting the wrong idea about you?" she said. "Or about us?" The message was clear. Belonging came with conditions. I felt something steady settle inside me. Not fear, not anger, but clarity. This wasn't concern. This was containment. She wasn't trying to help me. She was trying to limit my impact. I didn't argue. I didn't ask what she meant. I simply nodded. Her shoulders relaxed just slightly. Compliance was what she expected. Silence was what she trusted. After that, the exclusions became more overt. I found out about a family dinner after it happened. I learned about a weekend trip through photos posted online. Invitations stopped coming altogether, replaced by polite explanations delivered after the fact. "We didn't think you'd be interested. We assumed you were busy. It was last minute." Each excuse sounded reasonable on its own. Together they formed a pattern too consistent to ignore. When I brought it up once carefully, my sister sighed. "This is exactly what I mean," she said. "You always take things so personally. Why can't you just let things be easy?" Easy meant unquestioned. Our parents echoed her words without adding anything new. They urged peace, harmony, letting things go. They spoke as if fairness were negotiable and comfort was the higher value. I realized then that they weren't neutral. They were choosing a side without ever naming it. The final conversation before everything broke happened on an ordinary evening. No raised voices, no accusations. Just the quiet confidence of someone who believed she had already won. My sister stood near the window, arms crossed loosely, as if she were waiting for me to understand something obvious. "This isn't working," she said. "The tension, the distance, it's not healthy." I asked, "For who?" "For everyone," she replied smoothly. "And honestly, it might be better if you took some time away. Clear your head, figure out what you want." The suggestion was framed as generosity, space, time. But there was no invitation to return. I looked at my parents again, hoping for resistance, for confusion, for anything that suggested this hadn't already been discussed. They avoided my eyes. That was when I knew. The decision had already been made. The conversation wasn't about whether I would be pushed out. It was about how quietly it would happen. I didn't fight it. I didn't plead. I didn't defend myself. There was no point arguing with a verdict that had been delivered long before the trial. As I left the room, I understood something with absolute certainty. I wasn't being excluded because I was a problem. I was being excluded because I refused to be managed. And once someone decides you're a liability, your presence is no longer negotiable. It's temporary. Until it isn't. It happened without drama. No shouting, no slammed doors, no accusations thrown back and forth. That was the part that stayed with me the most. How calm it all was, like a decision that had been rehearsed until it felt reasonable. It was evening. The house was quiet in the way it gets after dinner when dishes are done and the television hums softly in the background. My sister stood near the entryway, keys on the console table beside her. Our parents sat on the couch, angled toward the screen, pretending to watch something they weren't actually following. She didn't ask me to sit down. "We need to talk," she said, but her tone suggested the conversation had already ended. I waited. "This situation isn't sustainable," she continued. "The tension, the misunderstandings. It's affecting everyone." I glanced at our parents, expecting at least a question, a pause, something to interrupt the momentum. My mother adjusted a cushion. My father cleared his throat and said nothing. My sister met my eyes steady and composed. "You should leave tonight," she said. "It's better this way." I felt my chest tighten, but my voice stayed calm. "Leave where?" She exhaled slowly, as if I were making this harder than necessary. "You'll figure it out," she said. "You always do." Then she added the part that made it permanent. "And don't come back." The words landed softly, like something she'd practiced saying in a mirror, until it no longer felt cruel. I stood there waiting for someone to object, for my parents to say this was too far, that it was late, that we should talk in the morning. No one did. My mother finally spoke, her voice careful. "Your sister just thinks some space might help," she said. "We don't want this to get worse than what I wondered." I looked at my father. He stared at the floor, hands folded tightly in his lap. He didn't meet my eyes. That was when something inside me went still. I understood then that this wasn't an argument I could win. This wasn't about resolving anything. This was about removal. Quiet, efficient, and justified by everyone's need for peace. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself or explain how we'd gotten here. I didn't remind them of the years I'd spent trying to make things easier, smaller, more acceptable. I nodded once. "Okay," I said. My sister's shoulders relaxed just slightly, as if she'd been bracing for resistance. She stepped aside, clearing the path to the stairs. I packed quickly, not because I was in a hurry, but because there was nothing left to consider. I took clothes, my laptop, a few personal items. I left behind books, photographs, things I'd once thought were irreplaceable. Nothing felt like mine anymore. When I came back downstairs with my bag, no one moved. My sister picked up her keys, a gesture that felt ceremonial. "This is for the best," she said. I didn't respond. I walked to the door, paused for half a second, then opened it. Cold air rushed in sharp and clean. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. No one followed. I stood on the porch for a moment, staring at the dark street, trying to orient myself. The house looked the same as it always had. Warm lights glowing through the windows, familiar, unchanged. Except I no longer belonged to it. I got into my car and sat there, hands on the steering wheel, breathing slowly until the tightness in my chest eased. My phone buzzed once. A text from my mother. "You shouldn't attend the party. You only embarrass us." There it was. The justification. Clean and final. I didn't reply. I drove away without a plan, without a destination beyond somewhere that wasn't there. The roads were mostly empty, the holiday lights blurring as I passed them. At some point, I pulled into a parking lot and just sat. The quiet pressed in around me, heavier than anything that had been said inside that house. I felt disoriented, not panicked, but unmoored. Like a rope had been cut, and I was drifting without resistance. What surprised me most was not the pain, though it was there, sharp and persistent. It was the clarity. I hadn't been expelled because I was unreasonable, or unstable, or difficult. I had been expelled because I no longer fit the narrative my sister was trying to protect. I was inconvenient. Eventually, I drove to a small apartment I'd arranged earlier, a place I hadn't expected to need so soon. I carried my bag inside, set it down by the door, and leaned back against the wall. The silence there was different. Empty, but honest. I slid down until I was sitting on the floor, my back against the wall, staring at nothing. For the first time that night, I let myself feel the weight of what I'd lost. Not the house, the illusion. I had spent years believing that if I stayed calm, if I stayed quiet, if I made myself easy enough to manage, I would always have a place. That belief left with me when I walked out the door. I didn't know then that leaving that house would save me. All I knew was that the door had closed and no one inside had tried to open it again. No one came after me. I waited for the sound of the door opening for footsteps on the porch for my phone to ring, with a voice telling me this had gone too far. None of that happened. The house behind me stayed quiet, sealed, as if my leaving had completed a task rather than created a crisis. That was how I knew it was final. The first night alone was not dramatic. I didn't cry until dawn. I didn't pace or call friends or replay the argument in my head. I unpacked the bag I'd brought, set my laptop on the small kitchen table, and sat on the edge of the bed until exhaustion pulled me under. The apartment was temporary, but it was mine. No expectations. No history clinging to the walls. Just space. In the morning, light filtered through thin blinds and landed on the floor in a narrow stripe. I made coffee with a borrowed mug and drank it standing up, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the building waking around me. Doors closing. Someone's radio. A car starting outside. It felt strange to exist without context, to be nowhere in particular. Messages started coming in later that day. Not from my parents, not from my sister. From people on the edges of my life who had heard something, though they didn't quite know what. "Are you okay? Heard you're taking some time. Hope you're getting the space you need." Each message carried a version of me I didn't recognize. Fragile. Overwhelmed. Difficult. I didn't correct them. I understood then that explaining myself would only keep me tethered to a story I hadn't written. Any response would invite questions, interpretations, adjustments. Silence for once felt cleaner. So I chose it. I didn't post anything. I didn't defend myself. I didn't reach out to extended family to clarify what had happened. I let the narrative sit where my sister had placed it, not because it was true, but because it no longer mattered. What mattered was what I did next. On the second day, I opened my laptop and returned to my work. Not as an escape, but as an anchor. The routines were familiar, the logic steady, progress visible in a way relationships never had been. Without interruption, my focus sharpened. I noticed things I'd been too distracted to see before. Gaps that needed closing, assumptions worth questioning, ideas that had been waiting patiently for attention. It wasn't that my work had suffered while I was with my family, it was that it had been competing with the constant effort of making myself acceptable. Freed from that, everything moved faster. By the end of the week, something unexpected happened. An email arrived from someone outside my family's orbit, someone who knew me only through my work. The message was straightforward, professional, curious. They wanted to talk. I read it twice, then once more, just to be sure I wasn't projecting meaning where there was none. There were no qualifiers in their tone, no hints of doubt, no softening language, just interest. The timing mattered. This didn't happen before I was asked to leave. It didn't rescue me from that moment or justify it retroactively. It happened after, when I had nothing left to prove and no one left to impress. That was when I realized something important. My value had never been conditional. Only my access had been. That night, I sat on the floor of the apartment with my back against the couch and let myself think about what had happened. Not the logistics, not the words exchanged, the pattern. I saw how often I'd minimized myself to keep things smooth, how frequently I'd let someone else speak for me because it was easier than correcting them, how much energy I'd spent trying to stay in a system that required my silence to function, leaving hurt. Staying would have hollowed me out. That was the reckoning. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sad in a way that was clean and uncomplicated, sad for what I'd hoped for. Sad for what had never been offered. But beneath that sadness was something steadier. Relief. I slept better after that. Deeper. Longer. The kind of sleep you get when you're no longer bracing for impact. The days took on a rhythm. Work. Walks. Simple meals. Long stretches of quiet where my thoughts were my own. I stopped anticipating messages that never came. I stopped checking my phone for names that had chosen silence. The absence hurt less as time passed. It was replaced by clarity. I began to understand that I hadn't been pushed out because I was weak. I had been pushed out because I could no longer be controlled quietly. And control requires proximity. Distance, it turns out, is powerful. By the end of the week, I had made a decision without announcing it to anyone. I wasn't going back to ask for explanations. I wasn't going to demand apologies or closure. I didn't need them. Whatever came next would not involve me knocking on a door that had been closed with such certainty. If my family was ever going to hear my name again, it wouldn't be through gossip or concern or careful phrasing. It would be through something they couldn't soften or manage. I didn't know exactly when that would happen. I only knew that when it did, I wouldn't be the one making the call. New Year's Eve arrived without ceremony. I didn't dress up. I didn't pour a drink or turn on the television to watch someone else count down to something I no longer shared. I sat at the small table in my apartment, laptop, closed phone, face down, the room lit by a single lamp that hummed softly when the heat kicked on. I knew where my family was. I knew my sister had been planning that night for weeks, down to the guest list and the seating and the exact impression she wanted to leave behind. I knew our parents would be there early, smiling proud, relieved that things were back on track. Back to a version of the family where I no longer existed. The strange thing was that I didn't feel excluded anymore. I felt removed, like a piece taken off a board after the game had already been decided. Everything that was about to happen had been set in motion long before that night. There was nothing for me to do except let it unfold. Just before midnight, I checked the time once. 11:58. I didn't refresh any pages. I didn't open any apps. I had learned enough about control to know when not to touch something. When the moment came, it didn't announce itself with sound. There was no alert, no dramatic vibration, no rush of messages all at once. Just a quiet shift, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. My name appeared, not as a rumor, not as speculation, not as something filtered through anyone else's explanation. Just facts. Clear, concise, impossible to reinterpret. I read it slowly, line by line, making sure I wasn't imagining it. The scope, the scale, the acknowledgement. All the things that had been minimized, softened, dismissed over the years, laid out plainly without apology. I closed my eyes for a moment and breathed. I didn't feel joy the way I thought I might. There was no surge of triumph or rush of adrenaline. What I felt was stillness, like a room after a long argument finally goes quiet. Midnight came and went without me marking it. Somewhere across town, glasses clinked, music swelled, people counted down in unison, celebrating the promise of a clean break from the past. I sat alone and watched the clock change from 11:59 to 12:00, knowing that while nothing in my room had changed, everything outside it had. The truth was no longer contained. I thought about my sister then, standing in a room full of people who trusted her judgment. I thought about how carefully she curated perception, how much effort she put into managing what others saw. I wondered who would notice first. Who would glance down at a phone distracted for just a second and feel the air shift around them? Who would read my name and pause, confused, recalculating? I didn't imagine her reaction. I didn't need to. This wasn't about watching anyone fall apart. It was about watching something I had built stand on its own. The phone stayed quiet for a while. I made tea and carried the mug back to the table, the steam fogging my glasses as I took the first sip. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I'd expected to feel exposed raw, like I'd stepped into a spotlight without warning. Instead, I felt anchored. For years, I'd lived inside other people's interpretations. Tonight, there was no room for interpretation at all. A few notifications appeared, then stopped. Messages from people who knew how to read without asking questions. People who understood what restraint looked like. I didn't open them yet. I didn't want to rush this moment by filling it with noise. At 12:01, my phone lit up. My younger brother's name filled the screen. I stared at it for a long second, the tea cooling between my palms. I hadn't heard his voice since before I left the house. He'd always been quieter than my sister, more uncertain, caught between loyalty and discomfort. I could already hear the panic in his voice before I answered. I picked up the phone and said nothing. "What did you do?" he whispered, breathless. "Dad just saw the news and he's not breathing right. He's not okay." I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. There it was, the collision between the world they controlled and the one they never bothered to look at closely. I didn't do anything I said calmly. I just didn't stop it. He started talking all at once, words tumbling over each other, confusion, accusations, fear. I listened without interrupting the way I'd learned to do when people were unraveling. In the background, I could hear voices. My sister's voice cut through them, sharp and controlled, trying to impose order on something that refused to be contained. Someone was crying. Someone else was asking questions no one could answer. The party, I realized, was over. "This isn't what you think," my brother said, his voice breaking. "They're saying you planned this, that you waited for tonight." I smiled faintly, though he couldn't see it. "I've been working for years," I said. "Tonight just happened to be when it became visible." He went quiet. I didn't explain further. I didn't defend myself or offer reassurance. I wasn't interested in being understood in that moment. Understanding would come later if it came at all. What mattered was that the truth no longer required my permission to exist. "I have to go," I said after a moment. "Wait," he said quickly. "They want to talk to you." I imagined my sister reaching for the phone, her expression tight, her words already forming into something strategic and urgent. "No," I said gently. "Not tonight." I ended the call before he could argue. The room fell quiet again, deeper this time, like a breath held, and finally released. I set the phone face down and sat there listening to the hum of the heater, the distant sound of fireworks somewhere I couldn't see. The new year had begun, not with reconciliation, not with forgiveness, but with the truth standing where it had always belonged. By morning, the silence had turned hostile. I woke to my phone vibrating against the nightstand, the screen lighting up with missed calls stacked one on top of another. Numbers I didn't recognize, names I hadn't seen in years. A few messages from people who had never spoken to me directly before, suddenly urgent, suddenly familiar. I didn't answer any of them. I made coffee and stood by the window while the city moved on as if nothing had happened. People walked dogs. A delivery truck idled at the corner. Someone laughed too loudly across the street. It felt surreal knowing that somewhere else an entirely different world was on fire. The first article had already been shared thousands of times. By noon, it wasn't just one outlet anymore. It was a pattern. Headlines echoed each other, reframed but unmistakable. My name appeared again and again, no longer buried in footnotes or attached to someone else's narrative. This time, it stood alone. I sat back down at the table and opened my laptop. Not to read comments, not to monitor reactions. I opened the folder I'd built over years, the one I'd promised myself I might never need. Emails, documents, timelines, proof. I didn't upload anything yet. I just looked at it, reminding myself why this wasn't impulsive, why it wasn't cruel, why it wasn't something that could be undone by someone raising their voice. At 1:30, my sister called. Her name flashed across the screen like a challenge. I let it ring. She called again immediately. Then again. Then from a private number. I waited until the fourth call before answering. "What did you think would happen?" she snapped, skipping every pretense. "Did you think we wouldn't notice? That you could just drop this and disappear again?" I pictured her pacing phone pressed too tightly to her ear, already rehearsing how she'd frame this once she regained control of the room. I didn't drop anything I said evenly. I let it surface. "You knew exactly what you were doing," she said. "You waited until New Year's. You wanted to humiliate us." "No," I said. "I waited until it was finished." She laughed, sharp and incredulous. "You always do this. You sit quietly and then act like you're innocent when things blow up. There it was, the familiar rewrite, the version where my restraint was provocation and my silence was manipulation. You told me not to come back, I said. I respected that. That was different, she shot back. That was family business. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling. So was my work. Her breathing changed. I could hear it. A fraction of a second where she recalculated, searching for leverage that had already evaporated. You're destroying everything Mom and Dad built, she said, lowering her voice. Do you have any idea what this is doing to them? I thought about our parents' text message, the one that had arrived without punctuation or warmth. You shouldn't attend the party. You only embarrass us. I wasn't invited to build anything I said. I was invited to stay quiet. That's not true. It is, I replied. You just didn't think I'd stop agreeing to it. She was silent for a beat, then said, Take it down. I smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. You still think I control it, I said. I don't. You can issue a statement, she insisted. Clarify things. Say it was misunderstood. I won't lie for you, I said. Not again. Her voice hardened. If you don't fix this, there will be consequences. For who I asked. For all of us. I ended the call before she could answer. The next wave came from our parents. Voicemails one after another. My mother's voice strained but controlled, like she was still trying to host a dinner party in the middle of an evacuation. My father's message was shorter. He asked me to call him. He said we needed to talk. I didn't respond. By afternoon, the narrative had shifted again. Someone had leaked a statement from my sister's side, vague and defensive, heavy on emotion and light on substance. Words like betrayal and misunderstanding floated through it, unsupported, hollow. It didn't land the way she expected. People were asking questions now, the kind that don't go away once they're asked. I received a message from an old colleague, someone who'd left years ago without explanation. He wrote 2 sentences. I always wondered why that project changed hands. I'm glad you didn't disappear. I closed my laptop and rested my forehead against my hands. For the first time, I felt the weight of it all. Not guilt, not regret, but gravity. This wasn't just a moment. It was a shift. A line drawn so clearly that going back would require erasing myself entirely. That evening, another call came in. This time I recognized the number before it rang. I answered. My father didn't waste time. Your sister is spiraling, he said quietly. She didn't see this coming. Neither did you, I thought, but I didn't say it. You need to help us contain this, he continued. People are asking questions we can't answer. I stared at the wall across from me, the faint mark where a picture frame used to hang. I spent years answering questions no one asked, I said. I'm done explaining myself. He sighed long and tired. You didn't have to do it this way. I closed my eyes. There was never a way that would have satisfied you. Silence stretched between us. Finally, he said, Your sister thinks you've won. I opened my eyes. This isn't a competition. It feels like one to her. That's not my responsibility. When the call ended, the apartment felt smaller, tighter, like it was adjusting to a new truth. Night fell slowly. I stood by the window again, watching lights turn on one by one across the city. Somewhere my sister was still trying to control the narrative, still believing volume could overpower facts. I wasn't angry anymore. I was finished. And for the first time, I understood the difference. The first official statement came just after noon, and it was weaker than I expected. It was posted on the family company's website, carefully worded, unsigned, heavy, with phrases like ongoing review and internal matter. No denial, no confirmation. Just enough distance to suggest panic without admitting it. I read it once and closed the page. By then the calls had slowed, replaced by messages that felt more deliberate. Lawyers, journalists. A producer from a business network asking for comment. I declined all of them through a single email drafted with 3 sentences and no emotion. I am not available for comment at this time. All information released is factual and verified. Further inquiries can be directed to my counsel. That afternoon, my younger brother finally called. His voice sounded different than it had the night before. Less frantic, more careful. Like he'd spent the morning listening instead of talking. "I didn't know," he said, after a pause. "Not all of it." I didn't interrupt. "They're saying you planned this," he continued. "That you waited for the worst possible moment." "I waited for the right one," I said. He exhaled slowly. "Mom hasn't stopped crying." I looked down at my hands steady on the table. She stopped talking to me long before she stopped crying. "That's not fair." "Neither was pretending I didn't exist," I replied. There was silence, then a quiet admission. "I should have called you sooner." "Yes," I said. "You should have." He didn't argue. "I just wanted you to know," he said. "I don't think you're wrong." That surprised me more than any headline had. After the call, I stepped outside for the first time all day. The air was cold and sharp, clearing my head. I walked without direction, phone tucked away, letting the city absorb some of the noise I'd been carrying. Halfway down the block, my phone buzzed again. A text from an unfamiliar number. "I'm sorry it took this long to see it. You were never the problem." I stopped walking. The message didn't include a name, but I knew who it was from. An aunt who had married into the family years ago. Someone who had watched from the edges, careful not to interfere. Someone who had once squeezed my hand at a wedding and whispered, "You're stronger than you know." I typed a reply, deleted it, then typed again. "Thank you. That means more than you realize." By evening, the story had evolved again. Screenshots circulated, timelines aligned. A few independent analysts began breaking things down publicly, pointing out inconsistencies that were impossible to explain away. The narrative my sister had relied on for years started collapsing under its own weight. I didn't celebrate. I cooked dinner. Simple, quiet, something grounding. While it simmered, another notification came through. This one from a business contact I respected. "Congratulations. You didn't just protect yourself, you changed the rules." I sat down at the table and let that sink in. That night, my sister sent one last message. This didn't have to be permanent. I stared at the words for a long time. She was still thinking in terms of control, of temporary fallout, of rearranging pieces until things looked familiar again. I typed back slowly. "It was permanent the moment you told me not to come back." No response followed. Later, as midnight approached, I opened my laptop one final time, not to monitor the chaos, but to look forward. A draft document waited on my screen. Clean. Empty. No family names attached to it. Just mine. I began outlining what came next. New goals, new boundaries, a future not built around managing other people's discomfort. When I finally closed the laptop, the apartment was silent, but it felt different than it had the night before. Not lonely. Resolved. Somewhere across the city, my family was still scrambling, still trying to negotiate with a reality that no longer bent around them. I wasn't watching anymore. I had already stepped out of the frame they'd built for me. And this time, I wasn't coming back. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in layers. The next morning, the house I grew up in appeared on my screen for the first time in years. Not through a memory or a photograph I'd chosen, but through someone else's lens. A reporter stood outside the gate, winter coat pulled tight, breath visible as she spoke into a microphone. "Sources confirm internal turmoil following the overnight revelations," she said. "The family has declined to comment." I turned it off. I didn't need to see my childhood reduced to B-roll. What I did need to do was work. For years, I'd compartmentalized my life, pushing my real ambitions into narrow hours, stolen from obligation. Now there were no interruptions. No calls asking me to smooth things over. No pressure to make myself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. Just clarity. By midday, the internal shakeup became public. My sister had been removed from day-to-day control, officially temporary, unofficially irreversible. The language was polite. The meaning wasn't. I read the announcement once, then forwarded it to my attorney without comment. An hour later, my father called again. This time, his voice didn't carry authority. It carried exhaustion. "She's packing her office," he said quietly. "She doesn't know what comes next." I leaned back in my chair, eyes on the ceiling. "Neither did I said. "For a long time." He swallowed. "Your mother isn't handling this well." I closed my eyes. She didn't handle me well either. Silence filled the line thick and heavy. "You don't have to cut us off completely," he said finally. "We're still your family." The word family landed differently now. Less sacred, more conditional. "I didn't cut anyone off," I said. I stepped away. "That feels the same to her." "It isn't," I replied. "One is punishment. The other is survival." He didn't argue. "I should have protected you," he said, voice breaking. "I should have said something sooner." I felt a familiar ache, sharp but distant, like an old injury flaring in cold weather. "Yes," I said. "You should have." When the call ended, I didn't feel relief. I felt closure beginning to take shape, slow and deliberate. That afternoon, I received a message I hadn't expected. An invitation. Not to reconcile. Not to explain. To speak. A professional organization I'd admired for years wanted me to share my experience. Not as a scandal, as a case study in ownership boundaries and quiet power. I stared at the email for a long time. Part of me wanted to decline, to stay private, to let the story fade. But another part of me remembered every dinner where my achievements were minimized, every moment I'd been told to wait my turn, to be patient, to be grateful for scraps of recognition. I typed back, "Yes, on my terms." That night I dreamed of the front door closing behind me, not slamming, just clicking shut. In the morning, I woke with an unfamiliar sense of calm. The news cycle was already moving on, reshaping the narrative, finding its next obsession. But something important had shifted beneath the surface. People were talking differently now. Not about drama, about precedent, about what happens when someone refuses to quietly disappear. My younger brother texted me late that evening. "She keeps saying she never meant it to go this far." I read the message without emotion. "Then you should tell her intentions don't erase impact," I replied. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "I'm trying to stay out of it," he wrote. "But I wanted you to know, I'm proud of you." I set the phone down and let myself feel that for a moment. Not vindication, recognition. As the week closed, the house I'd been exiled from felt farther away than ever. Not because I missed it, but because it no longer defined the edges of my life. I rearranged my space. Threw out old boxes I'd been dragging from apartment to apartment like evidence I might need someday. Photos that made me hesitate. Letters that apologized without changing anything. I kept only what felt honest. On Sunday evening, as the sky darkened and the city lights flickered on, I sat by the window again. This time I wasn't watching other people celebrate. I was watching myself breathe freely in a life that finally fit. The silence around me wasn't hostile anymore. It was earned. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that whatever came next wouldn't require permission from anyone who had once told me to leave. I had already proven something far more important. I could stay. 1 year later, New Year's Eve didn't feel like a deadline anymore. It felt like a marker. I stood in my apartment as dusk settled outside the windows, the city humming in that low, anticipatory way it always did on the last night of the year. There were no invitations on the counter, no unanswered messages demanding my presence, no obligation disguised as tradition. Just quiet. Chosen quiet. I poured a glass of wine and let myself remember the woman I had been exactly 12 months earlier. the one who sat on the floor with her back against the doorcoat, still on phone face down beside her, wondering how being told to leave had hurt more than being unwanted ever had before. She thought survival meant endurance. I knew better now. The fallout had settled into facts. My sister had resigned fully, not in disgrace, but without ceremony. The company rebranded. New leadership. Public apologies written by consultants who knew how to say everything and nothing at once. Our parents had retreated from the spotlight, clinging to a version of the past that no longer matched reality. We spoke rarely. And when we did, it was honest in a way that used to terrify me. My father and I met for coffee twice that year. Neutral ground. Short conversations. No rewriting. No pressure to fix anything that wasn't ready. He asked about my work. Really asked. I answered without shrinking. My mother never called. For a long time I thought that would feel like a loss. Instead, it felt like clarity. The project I'd started the night everything broke open had grown into something solid. Not just successful, but mine in a way I'd never compromised. No borrowed credibility. No hidden labor. No one standing beside me taking credit for my silence. I was invited into rooms now where I didn't have to explain why I belonged. People listened when I spoke. And when they didn't, I walked away. That was the real power I hadn't known I was building all along. As midnight approached, my phone buzzed. Messages from people who had been part of my life by choice, not obligation. A simple Happy New Year. A heart. A photo of fireworks somewhere else in the world. One message stood out. From my younger brother. I hope you're okay tonight. I know this day is complicated. I typed back. It used to be. Not anymore. Outside, fireworks cracked open, the sky flashes of color reflected in the glass. I counted the seconds without ceremony, without holding my breath. When the year turned, nothing dramatic happened. No calls, no apologies, no last-minute attempts to rewrite the ending. And that was the point. I stood there for a long moment, glass warm in my hand, and felt something I'd never felt on this night before. Peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on everyone else behaving properly. The durable kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are, what you deserve, and what you will never accept again. If you're listening to this and parts of it feel uncomfortably familiar, I want you to know something. Being told to leave is not the same as being unworthy of staying. Sometimes being pushed out is the moment you finally stop waiting for permission. If you've ever been made to feel like your presence was a problem, your work was inconvenient, or your truth was too disruptive to be welcomed, you're not alone. And you're not wrong for wanting more than silence in exchange for loyalty. I'd love to hear where you're listening from tonight, or what this story stirred up for you. You don't have to share everything. Even a few words are enough to let someone else know they're not alone either. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe in quiet strength, hard boundaries, and the kind of justice that doesn't need to shout, stay with me. There are more stories ahead, and they're for people who refuse to disappear. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And wherever you are, whatever year you're stepping into next, I hope you choose yourself without apology.